When I bought the cabin, it was meant to be a retreat from everything. I'd spent years working long hours in the city, grinding through endless weeks of deadlines, noise, and the steady hum of traffic that never quite let me sleep. The cabin was my answer to all of that. A sanctuary tucked away in a wooded community where tall pines whispered in the wind. The lake sparkled just beyond the tree line, and the pace of life slowed to a crawl. The cabin itself wasn't grand, not in the way mountain estates advertised themselves on glossy vacation brochures. It was modest. 2 stories, cedar siding weathered to a warm amber, a wraparound porch that creaked in the evening as the wood cooled from the sun. Inside, the floors were knotty pine, the kitchen small but functional, the fireplace the centerpiece of the living room. It was the kind of place where you could drink coffee in the morning while deer wandered through the yard, unafraid of people, and the kind of place where the stars at night seemed impossibly close. I hadn't planned on joining an HOA when I bought it. If I'm honest, the phrase homeowners association had always left a sour taste in my mouth. Too many stories floated around about self-important board members who treated neighborhoods like their own tiny kingdoms. But the community where my cabin stood had one, and the realtor explained it in such casual tones that I thought nothing of it. "They're mostly for upkeep," she had said. "Snow plowing, shared trail maintenance, dock access. Nothing to worry about." At first, she wasn't wrong. The fees weren't outrageous, and I enjoyed the perks. The trails that wound through the woods were always cleared. The lake access point remained clean and well-maintained, and during the winter months, I didn't have to lift a finger when heavy snow buried the roads. For the first year, it felt worth it. Then I met Karen. Her actual name was something else, but everyone knew her as Karen. She wasn't the HOA president, though you'd be forgiven for assuming she was. She wasn't even on the board officially. But she was the kind of person who acted as though the neighborhood belonged to her, and the board often gave in to her because she was loud, persistent, and relentless. She lived just 3 cabins down from mine, in a place far larger than mine, with an extended deck and floor-to-ceiling windows she often left uncovered at night. People whispered that her husband worked in real estate and that's how they afforded it, but no one really knew. What everyone did know was that she made it her business to monitor everything happening in the community. At first, her interference was little more than an annoyance. She would stand at the community dock and scold teenagers for jumping in too loudly. She would send out mass emails about cars that were parked half a foot over the line. She complained about the color of someone's shutters, about kids leaving bikes in driveways, about the noise of dogs barking. Small things, trivial things, but constant. Her voice carried through the pines in that shrill way that never quite blended into the background. For the most part, I kept my distance. I wasn't here full-time anyway. The cabin was still a retreat for weekends and occasional weeks off. My main home remained in the city, and the cabin was a place to breathe. That limited my exposure to Karen, though she made a point of introducing herself within days of my purchase. She had shown up at my porch with a binder in her arms, her tone sharp as she welcomed me to the community. The binder contained HOA guidelines, of course, though she had printed extra pages of unwritten rules she claimed were just as important. I remember standing there, tired from unloading boxes, as she explained how to properly angle trash bins, how often I should trim my hedges, and how she didn't tolerate short-term renters. That last one, she said with particular venom, even though it didn't apply to me. I had no intention of renting out my place. This was my sanctuary. Still, she lingered on the point as if she expected me to one day violate it. Over time, I grew used to her presence the way you grow used to a dripping faucet. Annoying, but tolerable. I smiled when necessary, nodded when cornered, and did my best to avoid her. For a while, that worked, but then life shifted. Work demanded more from me, and the cabin sat empty for longer stretches. Weeks turned to months when I didn't visit. I kept up with the bills, the HOA fees, the occasional handyman visits, but I wasn't physically present. I missed it, but there was little I could do. That's when Karen truly took notice of my absence. At first, it was subtle. An email from the HOA noting that neighbors had concerns about my property looking unoccupied. Then a phone call asking if I planned on renting it out. When I reassured them that I wasn't, the matter seemed closed, at least on paper. But I had a sinking feeling that Karen's eyes were on my cabin in ways I didn't fully understand. The first clue came when I returned unexpectedly one autumn weekend. I'd had a brutal week at work and decided to escape to the cabin without warning. When I arrived, everything looked as it should, at least on the outside. But inside, I noticed small things out of place. A throw blanket folded differently than I remembered. A glass mug that hadn't been washed properly sitting on the counter. A faint smell of cologne that wasn't mine. It unsettled me, but I brushed it off as forgetfulness. Maybe the handyman had come in to check something. Maybe I had left the mug there. I convinced myself it was nothing. Still, the feeling gnawed at me. And over the next few months, similar instances occurred whenever I came back unannounced. Shoes scuffed in the mudroom. Towels hung in the bathroom in ways I never left them. A half-empty bottle of wine in the recycling bin, though I hadn't touched wine in months. The thought that someone might be using my cabin crept into my mind, but I dismissed it as paranoia. I changed the locks just in case. I told myself it was over. Then winter came, heavy and cold, burying the roads and blanketing the lake in ice. I didn't visit the cabin for nearly 3 months. When I finally drove up in early spring, the snow melting into rivulets down the roadside ditches, I found tire tracks in my driveway. Fresh tracks. Too fresh. Inside, the evidence was undeniable. My linens had been used. The refrigerator was stocked with groceries I hadn't purchased. A suitcase, an actual suitcase, sat tucked beneath the bed in the guest room. My stomach dropped. Someone had been living here. Not just visiting, living. And not in secret either. They had been comfortable enough to bring luggage. I left in a daze that day, locking every door and window, unsure what to do. The cabin felt violated, like it no longer belonged solely to me. I planned to install cameras, maybe even file a police report. But work dragged me away again, and time slipped through my fingers. It wasn't until that summer, when I finally cleared a stretch of time for myself, that everything came crashing down. I returned to the cabin expecting peace, expecting to reclaim the solitude I had purchased it for. Instead, I found chaos waiting for me. The driveway was packed with cars, 3 of them, none I recognized. The porch was littered with coolers and folding chairs, and through the open windows, I heard the unmistakable sound of people laughing, drinking, making themselves at home. My heart pounded as I realized the truth. Someone had turned my cabin into their personal getaway, and as I would soon discover, that someone was none other than Karen herself. But the most shocking part, when I walked up to my own door, key in hand, she didn't greet me with shame or surprise. She greeted me with fury. Within minutes, she was on the phone with the police, screaming about trespassing, screaming at me, the owner of the cabin, as though I were the intruder. It was in that moment, standing on the porch of my own home as sirens began to wail in the distance, that I realized this was only the beginning. The sirens grew louder as I stood frozen on my own porch, Karen's shrill voice carrying over the sound of music and laughter from inside my cabin. She was on the phone still, pacing my driveway like she owned it, her hands flailing in exaggerated gestures as if the dispatcher on the other end could see her. Inside my cabin, the laughter quieted. Feet shuffled. I caught glimpses of faces peeking from behind curtains, strangers with drinks in their hands, looking confused and wary. My chest tightened with every second, the absurdity of the situation sinking in deeper. Not only had Karen filled my cabin with her guests, but now she was weaponizing law enforcement against me, the rightful owner, to cover her tracks. The first patrol car pulled up quickly, gravel crunching beneath its tires. Karen darted toward it before the officer had even stepped out, her voice shrieking about a dangerous man trying to break into her friend's cabin. Her words tangled into one another, laced with panic, her tone so dramatic it might have convinced anyone who didn't know better. The officer's eyes shifted to me. I stood on the porch with my keys still in my hand, trying to hold myself steady against the storm brewing in front of me. I could feel the tension radiating from Karen, from the strangers inside. From the very walls of the cabin I had once associated only with peace. The questions came fast. Who was I? What was I doing here? Why was Karen saying I didn't belong? My voice felt heavy in my throat as I explained slowly, clearly, that this was my cabin, my deed, my property. I showed my ID, my key. I repeated myself, calm but firm, as Karen continued to shriek about danger and trespassers. It was surreal, standing in front of my own home, forced to justify my presence while the woman who had stolen it spun lies with the confidence of someone who had been practicing. The officer listened, his expression caught between skepticism and irritation, and then he asked the question that made my stomach twist. "Can you prove ownership right now?" Of course, the paperwork was not in my back pocket. The deed was locked in a fireproof safe back in the city. I had digital copies, yes, but no internet signal reached my cabin's wooded lot. Karen seized on that gap like a hawk on prey. She raised her voice, insisting I was lying, insisting her friends had rented this place legitimately, insisting she had seen me lurking before and knew I was trouble. Her certainty was a weapon sharper than any blade. The officer wavered, caught in the clash of two stories, one loud and emotional, the other quiet and factual. And then the backup arrived, another patrol car, then a third. The flashing lights cast the pines in harsh colors, red and blue dancing over the bark as more officers stepped out. The guests inside spilled onto the porch then, emboldened by Karen's performance. They looked at me like I was the intruder, their brows furrowed, their voices echoing her claims. Some said they had paid good money to stay here. Some said Karen had arranged everything, assured them it was all above board. Their confusion was genuine, but their presence was devastating. Each word out of their mouths twisted the narrative further against me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drag them all inside and point out the family photos on the mantel, the worn sweater still draped over my favorite chair, the lockbox with my name etched on it. But every instinct told me to stay calm. Anger would only feed Karen's story, so I breathed, slow and deliberate, and I asked for time. I told the officers I could drive into town, pull the deed from my email, and show them proof. They agreed, though their suspicion lingered in the air. Karen smirked when she thought they weren't looking, her arms crossed in smug triumph. She had nearly pulled it off, nearly stolen my home out from under me with nothing more than volume and nerve. But her smirk faltered when I returned from town. Paperwork in hand, the county's records pulled up on my phone. The officers compared the name, the address, the parcel number. Their expressions shifted, suspicion sliding off me and settling squarely onto her. Karen didn't back down. She doubled down. She claimed the documents must be fake, claimed there had been some transfer I was hiding, claimed anything at all to keep her narrative alive. But the officers weren't buying it anymore. Their tone with her hardened, their questions sharp. Her guests grew restless then, murmuring among themselves as the reality sank in. They weren't in a legitimate rental. They had been duped. Their weekend getaway was built on lies. One by one, their anger turned, not at me, but at Karen. Still, the officers didn't haul her away. They told me it was a civil matter, that the courts would need to sort it out if I wanted to press charges. They asked the guests to leave, though they gave them time to gather their things. And they told Karen in no uncertain terms that she had no right to be here. It should have been a victory. It should have felt like reclaiming my home. But as I stood on the porch watching strangers carry coolers and bags out of my cabin, as Karen argued and screeched until the very last moment, as the flashing lights finally faded down the road, I felt hollow. The damage was already done. My privacy had been shattered, my sanctuary violated. The smell of perfume lingered in the air, the cushions on my couch indented from bodies that weren't mine or my family's. My refrigerator was half empty, my pantry raided. And worst of all, I realized this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to back down, not after being humiliated in front of officers and neighbors. That night, I sat on the porch in the quiet aftermath. The cicadas buzzing in the trees, the stars bright overhead. I thought about installing cameras, about changing locks again, about calling an attorney first thing in the morning. But I also thought about Karen's face as the officers turned against her. That look of venomous hate wasn't the end of her war. It was the beginning. Sure enough, the very next day, emails from the HOA flooded my inbox. Complaints about noise, accusations that I was hosting renters without permission, thinly veiled threats about fines and sanctions, all signed off by the board, but their language, their tone was unmistakably hers. Karen had lost one battle, but she was already preparing the next. And if I thought she had gone too far already, I was about to learn just how far she was willing to go to take what wasn't hers. The morning after the police cars rolled away, I expected quiet. I expected the usual cabin sounds, birds in the trees, wind through the pines, the creak of the porch boards when I stepped outside with a cup of coffee. Instead, I woke to the sharp ping of email after email. The subject lines told me everything. Violation notice. Immediate action required. HOA complaint. Unauthorized rental activity. Each message read the same. I had broken HOA rules by hosting unapproved renters. I was warned of fines, escalating by the day until I responded with an explanation and restitution. They cited bylaws, though they twisted the language until it no longer resembled the neat little packet I'd been given when I bought the cabin. They spoke of community trust and safety, of how my reckless actions had endangered the neighborhood. And although the emails carried the official HOA letterhead, I knew whose hand was behind them. The tone was unmistakable, every sentence dripping with Karen's brand of sanctimonious fury. She hadn't just shrugged off the humiliation of the night before. She had pivoted, attacking from a new angle, recruiting the very board that should have been protecting my rights as an owner. I scrolled through message after message, my jaw tightening, my chest burning. I typed out responses, calm, factual, attaching my deed, attaching the police report number, attaching every scrap of evidence I had. I pointed out that the guests weren't mine, that I hadn't rented my cabin, that the person responsible was Karen herself. The replies came back faster than I could read them. Dismissive, cold, demanding more, threatening escalation. It was as if my words were never even opened, as if the board had decided their truth and refused to see anything else. I shut my laptop and stared at the walls of my cabin. What had been my refuge now felt like a battleground, every log and beam dragged into a war I hadn't started. The next few days followed the same pattern. Emails, letters slipped under my door, a notice taped to my porch railing like some public shaming. Each one spoke of penalties and community harmony, each one echoing Karen's voice. She wanted me gone, or worse, she wanted to control my property for herself. I decided then that ignoring her would only give her room to expand. I needed to know how long this had been going on. I needed to know the scale of her scheme. So I started asking questions. I went into town, to the small cafe where locals gathered. At first I kept my inquiries casual. Had anyone heard of rentals in the community? Had anyone seen unusual traffic? The responses came slowly, but they came. One barista, after glancing around nervously, admitted she'd heard of people staying at the lake cabins without owning them. Another man, sipping coffee at the counter, mentioned his cousin had booked a weekend getaway through a woman who lived in the neighborhood. The pieces began to click together. Karen hadn't just used my cabin on a whim. She had been running a business. A shadow rental empire using properties she didn't own, presenting herself as some kind of community manager. The scale became clearer when I dug deeper. I pulled up short-term rental sites on my phone and scrolled through listings in my area. Most were legitimate, showing verified hosts, clean photos, normal rates. But then I saw it. A familiar cedar-sided cabin, my cabin, photographed from angles I didn't even know were flattering. The listing described it as a rustic retreat managed by a trusted community liaison. The host photo wasn't Karen's face, but the contact name? It matched her initials. I scrolled further, my pulse racing. There were other cabins, too. Cabins I recognized from the neighborhood, cabins owned by quiet retirees and seasonal families, all listed under the same host, all managed by Karen. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just me. She had been exploiting multiple properties, pocketing rental money, spinning lies to both guests and neighbors. And she had the audacity to weaponize the HOA against anyone who stood in her way. The next day, I printed everything. Screenshots of the listings, names, dates. I drove to the county clerk's office and requested property records, matching each listing to its rightful owner. The evidence piled up, undeniable, heavy in my hands. I thought this would be the end of it. I thought that armed with proof I could shut her down. But I underestimated her reach. When I brought my findings to the HOA board, presenting them in neat folders, their reaction wasn't shock or outrage. It was dismissal. They barely glanced at the papers before telling me the matter was outside their jurisdiction. They claimed they had no control over what Karen did, that my accusations were unfounded, that I was causing disruption. I left that meeting shaking, furious. They knew. They had to know. And instead of stopping her, they were protecting her. Whether out of fear, complicity, or sheer laziness, they had chosen her side. Back at the cabin, the retaliation intensified. Karen herself began circling my property, walking her dog at odd hours, pausing to photograph my yard, my car, my porch. She filed noise complaints when I so much as hammered a nail. She sent emails accusing me of having unauthorized gatherings when I was alone, reading by the fire. Then came the fines. Real fines printed on official HOA letterhead demanding hundreds of dollars for violations that didn't exist. Lawn overgrowth, trash bins left out, parking infractions. Each one fabricated, each one escalating. It was suffocating. Every morning I woke with dread, knowing there would be another letter, another threat, another twist of the knife. But the more she pushed, the more determined I became. If the board wouldn't stop her, if the police brushed it off as civil, then I would take matters into my own hands. I installed cameras around the cabin, hidden but precise. I logged every car that came down my drive, every face that appeared on my porch. I documented every false fine, every harassing email. I built a file thicker than any binder she had ever shoved at me. And then, late one night, the cameras caught exactly what I needed. Headlights swept across my drive just past midnight. Karen's car. She stepped out quietly, glancing around, and slipped a key into my front door. She entered like she belonged there. 20 minutes later, she exited again, carrying a bundle of sheets and a bag of toiletries. She didn't see the camera. She didn't know she had just handed me the evidence I needed. I stared at the footage over and over, equal parts vindicated and enraged. She hadn't stopped. Not after the police, not after being exposed, not after everything. She had grown bolder. The next morning, I copied the footage onto 3 separate drives. One for me, one for my lawyer, and one locked in a safe place. Because now I knew this wasn't just about fines or noise complaints or HOA politics. This was war. And Karen had no idea that for the first time, the evidence wasn't on her side. The footage of Karen slipping into my cabin replayed in my mind like a broken reel. Each frame was damning, each second a confirmation of what I had suspected all along. She wasn't just meddling. She was trespassing, stealing, and profiting off what was mine. With that proof in hand, I contacted a lawyer. He wasn't surprised by the story. He'd handled HOA disputes before, and though most were petty squabbles over fences or paint colors, he recognized the seriousness of what I showed him. He advised me to document everything, to prepare for a drawn-out fight. These cases move slowly, he warned. But with evidence this strong, she won't walk away clean. That reassurance gave me hope. For a moment, I imagined resolution. A courtroom, a judge reviewing the footage, Karen finally held accountable. But hope doesn't last long when you're up against someone who thrives on chaos, because Karen didn't wait for court. She retaliated immediately. The first signs were small but deliberate. I came back to the cabin one evening to find my porch railing smeared with something sticky, honey or syrup, drawing insects in swarms. The next morning, nails scattered across my driveway punctured both my tires. A week later, I found the padlock on my shed broken, the tools inside rearranged, some missing. At first, I wanted to believe it was coincidence. But deep down, I knew. It had Karen's fingerprints all over it, not literally, but in the way it reeked of spite. Then came the neighbors. It started with cold stares when I drove down the main road. Conversations that hushed when I entered the general store. People I had nodded to for years suddenly avoided eye contact. It was as if Karen had turned them, whispering poison into their ears until they saw me not as a fellow homeowner, but as a threat. The hostility grew clearer during the next HOA meeting. I went, folder of evidence under my arm, ready to push back. But as soon as I entered the room, I felt it. The weight of their glares, the undercurrent of judgment. Karen sat near the front, her posture rigid, her smile sharp. The meeting was chaos from the start. Karen accused me of harassment, of stalking, of inventing lies to cover for my supposed rental scheme. She waved around a stack of papers, fabricated complaints she claimed neighbors had filed against me. Each one painted me as a nuisance, a rule breaker, a danger. When I tried to present my evidence, the board cut me off. They called it inconclusive, claimed video footage could be misinterpreted, refused to let me finish a sentence. The entire room felt orchestrated, like a stage where every actor knew their role except me. By the end of the night, new fines were levied against me. Unapproved surveillance equipment. Disturbing the peace. Failure to comply with community spirit. Each phrase twisted. Each penalty another attempt to bleed me dry. I left shaking, fury boiling in my veins. The law was on my side, but here, in this insular little world Karen controlled, the truth didn't matter. Perception did. And she was winning that battle. Still, I wasn't about to fold. My lawyer filed motions. We compiled evidence into thick binders, each page more damning than the last. I notified other cabin owners whose properties I had discovered in Karen's listings. Some didn't believe me, but a few did. A retired couple reached out, horrified to learn strangers had stayed in their place while they wintered in Florida. Another family admitted they'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how deep it went. Slowly, I began building allies. Karen must have sensed it because her tactics grew bolder. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. I sat up, heart hammering, and grabbed the nearest flashlight. When I flicked it on, the beam caught movement, a figure darting away from my shed. The cameras confirmed it later. Karen herself, bundled in a hoodie, trying to tamper with the locks. Another time, I returned from town to find my front door wide open. Nothing was stolen, but drawers had been rifled through, cushions overturned, clothes pulled from closets. It wasn't robbery. It was intimidation. A message. You're not safe here. I filed reports with the sheriff, each one a brick in the wall I was building against her. But the deputies, though sympathetic, shrugged with the same refrain. Civil matter. Unless she was caught red-handed in the act, there was little they could do beyond take down my statements. The stress wore on me. Nights became sleepless, every creak in the cabin pulling me from rest, every car that slowed near my driveway making my chest seize. What had once been my sanctuary now felt like a fortress under siege. And then, the breaking point came. I was driving back to the cabin after a meeting with my lawyer when I noticed smoke curling into the sky above the treetops. My stomach dropped, panic surging as I floored the gas pedal. As I pulled into the drive, the sight nearly brought me to my knees. My cabin wasn't in flames, thank God, but a fire smoldered in the pile of brush I kept stacked near the shed. Someone had lit it, deliberately, unmistakably. The ground around it was scorched black, creeping dangerously close to the dry grass that led toward the cabin. If a breeze had caught it differently, if I had arrived even 30 minutes later, everything I owned could have gone up in smoke. I grabbed the hose, doused the fire until steam hissed into the air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When it was finally out, I stumbled back, coughing, trembling with the weight of what had almost happened. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room with the cameras pulled up on my laptop, every light on, waiting for her to try again. And as the hours stretched on, the realization hit me with crushing force. This wasn't just an HOA feud anymore. It wasn't about fines or board politics or noise complaints. This was personal. Karen wanted me gone. By any means necessary, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could fight her alone. The morning after the fire, I expected fear to be the thing that stayed with me. The image of blackened ground so close to my cabin, the smell of smoke still clinging to my clothes. It should have been enough to paralyze me. But what settled in my chest instead was anger. A heavy, steady anger that pushed me past fear and into resolve. Karen had escalated from harassment to sabotage. And if I didn't push back, she would keep going until my cabin was ash, my bank account was drained, and my name was smeared into nothing. I called my lawyer first thing, voice tight with fury. He listened carefully, took notes, and promised to add the attempted fire to the growing file. But his words were cautious. These cases take time. Time was the one thing I didn't feel I had. By the end of the week, Karen made her next move. It arrived in the mail, an official-looking envelope stamped with county markings. Inside, I found documents that made my stomach twist. A lien filed against my cabin. According to the paperwork, I owed thousands in unpaid fines to the HOA, and until it was resolved, they held claim against my property. It was fraudulent, every line built on lies. But the signature at the bottom wasn't Karen's. It belonged to the HOA treasurer, a man who'd barely spoken at meetings, always hunched in his chair, eyes downcast. He had signed off on her war. I called the clerk's office in town, furious, demanding clarification. They confirmed the lien had been filed properly, that it was now part of public record. If I wanted it removed, I'd need to contest it formally in court. More time, more money, more stress. I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread out before me, my coffee growing cold as the weight of it sank in. Karen had turned the system into a weapon. She didn't need to burn down my cabin when she could drown me in legalities, bleed me with bureaucracy. The neighbors noticed, too. Word spread quickly that I was behind on dues, that I was facing foreclosure. I caught whispers at the general store, saw the looks on their faces shift from wary to smug. In their eyes, Karen wasn't a villain. She was a watchdog, keeping the community clean. But not everyone bought it. A quiet knock came at my door one evening, and when I opened it, I found the retired couple I'd spoken to weeks earlier, the ones whose cabin had appeared in Karen's listings. They stepped inside nervously, clutching a folder. Inside were screenshots, emails, payment confirmations. They'd done their own digging after I warned them, and what they found matched my suspicions. Their cabin had been rented out at least 6 times during the past year, all through Karen's management. They had never seen a dime of it. Their evidence joined mine, thickening the file, weaving a clearer picture of Karen's scheme. And slowly, others began to come forward, too. Owners who had wondered why their locks felt tampered with, why things seemed out of place after long absences. A small faction began to form, whispering in opposition to Karen's reign, but opposition came at a cost. Those who sided with me found themselves targeted. One woman's mailbox was smashed to pieces. Another man discovered a letter from the HOA threatening to revoke his lake access privileges for unspecified violations. The message was clear: stand with me and Karen would make life unbearable. The community split down the middle. Some rallied behind Karen, convinced she was protecting them from my supposed misdeeds. Others aligned with me quietly, fearful of speaking too loudly lest they become her next target. The atmosphere turned toxic, every interaction tinged with suspicion. Meanwhile, my lawyer uncovered more. Digging through county records, he found inconsistencies, multiple properties tied to Karen's name in rental tax filings, yet none legally owned by her. It was a paper trail, faint but traceable, leading directly back to her fraudulent business. We began building a case not just against the HOA, but against Karen personally. Fraud, trespassing, harassment, potential arson. Each charge stacked higher, a tower of accusations waiting to topple. But Karen wasn't blind. She must have sensed the walls closing in because her behavior shifted again. She stopped the petty vandalism, stopped the obvious stunts. Instead, she leaned fully into her performance as the responsible neighbor. She hosted potlucks at her house, inviting board members and allies. She organized safety patrols to walk the neighborhood, all but declaring herself the sheriff. Her voice dripped with concern whenever she spoke of community standards, carefully painting me as the outlier. It was infuriating to watch. And yet beneath her polished veneer, cracks showed. I caught her car idling near my drive late at night, headlights off. My cameras captured her pacing her yard in restless circles, phone pressed tight to her ear. She was fighting to keep control, and control was slipping. The breaking point came during the next HOA meeting. I arrived armed with binders, my evidence, the retired couple's folder, the lawyer's research. I laid it all out on the table, demanding it be entered into the record. The board tried to brush me off, but the room wasn't on Karen's side anymore. Too many people had seen the listings online. Too many had whispered stories of missing items, unexplained guests, suspicious activity. The pressure mounted, voices rising, neighbors demanding answers. Karen snapped. Her mask slipped in an instant. She stood, red-faced, voice shrill, and began screaming about loyalty, about betrayal, about how she had protected this community from people like me. She ranted about how I didn't deserve the cabin, how I was never here, how she had put it to good use when I abandoned it. The room fell silent. Her words hung in the air like smoke, undeniable, unspinnable. She had confessed without realizing it. I walked out that night with shaking hands, my binder clutched tight. For the first time, I felt the tide turning. She wasn't invincible, but victory wouldn't come easily. Because even as she faltered in public, she lashed out in private. 2 days later, I found my car keyed from bumper to bumper. A week after that, a dead animal was left on my porch, its stench curling into the cabin walls. The line between harassment and menace blurred further with each act. And yet I didn't back down, because now I had momentum, now I had allies, and most importantly, now I had her words, her own confession, in front of witnesses. Karen had spent years building her little empire of control, her shadow rental business, her grip on the HOA. But the cracks were spreading fast, and soon, very soon, everything she had built would come crashing down. After Karen's meltdown at the HOA meeting, everything began to unravel. For years, she had held the neighborhood in a chokehold, wielding fear and intimidation as tools of control. But that night, her own words betrayed her, and the whisper network she had relied on turned against her. It didn't happen all at once. At first, the board tried to patch over the cracks, pretending the outburst had been a misunderstanding. They insisted the matter was under review, that no decisions could be made without further discussion. They sent out emails dripping with neutrality, trying to calm the community while avoiding blame. But the damage was done. Neighbors began questioning everything. How many violations had been fabricated? How many fines had been pocketed? How many cabins had been entered without permission? I could see the fear in Karen's face as those questions spread. She doubled down, storming from door to door, spinning new lies to anyone who would listen. She painted me as a con artist, the retired couple as senile, anyone who stood against her as untrustworthy. But the harder she pushed, the more desperate she looked. Meanwhile, my lawyer filed motions faster than she could react. Fraudulently challenged. Harassment? Documented. Trespassing. Supported by camera footage. The sheriff's office, once hesitant, began to take a harder look after I provided recordings of her confession and footage of her prowling my property. The file against her grew so thick it needed its own box. The first real blow came when one of her guests returned. A man in his 30s showed up at my cabin unannounced, suitcase in hand, claiming he had booked another stay. His confusion was genuine, and when I explained the truth, his face hardened with anger. Not at me, but at Karen. He admitted he'd paid her directly through a private channel, not the rental site. Thousands of dollars over several months. He left my porch vowing to contact the authorities. Word of his story spread quickly. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just a meddlesome neighbor, she was a scam artist. And that shift in perception was all it took to crack her grip. The HOA fractured down the middle. Half the board resigned in a single week, unwilling to attach their names to the growing scandal. The treasurer who had signed the fraudulent lien vanished from meetings altogether, rumored to be under investigation himself. Those who remained tried to distance themselves, claiming ignorance, pleading that they'd been manipulated. Karen, though, refused to retreat. She showed up at my driveway daily, sometimes screaming threats, sometimes standing silently with her arms crossed, staring like a predator sizing up prey. My cameras caught her tossing nails into the gravel again, spraying something acidic on the side of my car, even tampering with the hose line that ran to my water tank. Each act added to her record, but each one also added to my fear. The nights were the hardest. I lay awake, listening to every rustle outside, every creak of the cabin's old timbers. I dreamed of flames, of smoke curling under the door, of waking too late to escape. The attempted fire weeks earlier never left my mind. I kept an extinguisher in every room, checked my smoke alarms twice daily, lived in a constant state of hypervigilance. But even as fear gnawed at me, a strange sense of power grew alongside it. For the first time since this war began, Karen was losing. The sheriff's office finally opened an investigation. The county clerk marked the lien as disputed. My lawyer prepared filings for damages. Then, the moment I had been waiting for, the rental listings vanished. All of them. One day they were there, dozens of cabins with Karen's fingerprints all over them. The next they were gone, wiped clean. It was as if she thought erasing them would erase her crimes. But the internet never forgets. Screenshots, payment records, cached pages. They all remained, sitting in my file, waiting to be used. The collapse of her empire was messy. Guests she had duped began demanding refunds, some even filing small claim suits against her. Neighbors who had once whispered in her favor now whispered about cutting ties. The HOA, desperate to salvage its image, announced a restructuring, distancing itself from her influence. For the first time in years, Karen stood alone, and that's when she became dangerous. Late one night, my cameras pinged. I pulled up the feed and froze. Karen was on my porch, face twisted, hair wild, clutching a crowbar. She hammered it against my door, splintering the wood, screaming words I couldn't make out. My heart pounded as I dialed the sheriff, my voice shaking, begging them to come quickly. The minutes stretched like hours as she pounded, then turned on the windows, then the siding. By the time deputies arrived, she had vanished into the trees, leaving scars on the cabin's walls and dents in the porch rail. The deputies took my statement, reviewed the footage, promised action. But as I watched their taillights disappear down the road, I knew the truth. Karen wasn't done. She had nothing left to lose now. The next day, I packed a go-bag and left it by the door. Just in case, I couldn't shake the feeling that the final confrontation was coming, that this war wouldn't end in a courtroom or an HOA meeting. It would end here, at the cabin, where it had begun, and as much as I dreaded it, I was ready. Because I had spent months documenting, preparing, building a wall of truth she couldn't scale. Karen had spent years controlling this community with fear. But now fear was no longer on her side, it was on mine. The cabin no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like a battleground. Every shadow stretched too long, every creak in the walls echoed too loudly. Every night pressed heavy on my chest with the promise that Karen was still out there. After the crowbar attack, I knew she had passed the point of reason. She had lost her standing, her influence, her grip on the community. What she had left was rage. And rage has a way of feeding itself until it burns everything around it. I didn't sleep much in those days. I kept the go-bag near the door, my phone fully charged, and the security feed open on my tablet at all times. During the day, I worked with my lawyer in the sheriff's office, handing over footage, reports, every scrap of evidence I'd collected. At night, I sat awake with the lights off, watching the tree line through the windows, waiting for movement. The neighbors tried to help in small ways. The retired couple checked in often, bringing food, reminding me I wasn't as isolated as I felt. A few others left encouraging notes on my porch, but most people kept their distance, unwilling to risk Karen's wrath if she still had any power left to wield. I couldn't blame them. The HOA itself was in shambles. With half the board gone and the rest scrambling, meetings devolved into chaos. Proposals to dissolve the association entirely were floated, and for the first time in years, residents began questioning whether the HOA had been worth the misery it created. Karen, of course, was nowhere to be found in those meetings. She had stopped attending, stopped pretending to care about rules and bylaws. She was a ghost in the neighborhood, unseen, but felt everywhere. And then one night, she came back. It was just past midnight. The forest outside was quiet, the kind of stillness that presses into your ears until you hear your own heartbeat. I was drifting in and out of shallow sleep when the security app pinged. I sat up, groggy but alert, and tapped the screen. There she was. Karen stood at the edge of the tree line, her figure half lit by the security floodlight. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair hanging loose, her face pale and drawn. In one hand, she clutched something metallic, maybe the crowbar again, maybe something worse. She didn't move at first. She just stood there staring at the cabin, her chest rising and falling as though she had run a long distance. Then slowly she stepped forward into the light. My pulse hammered. I reached for my phone with one hand, my go bag with the other, ready to run. But I froze when I realized she wasn't charging. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't smashing. She was crying. Tears streaked her face as she staggered closer, muttering words I couldn't make out through the glass. She dropped the metal object onto the gravel with a clatter and collapsed onto her knees at the foot of my porch. For a long, terrible moment, I just watched. This was the woman who had tormented me for months, who had tried to ruin me, who had nearly burned my home to the ground. And now she was broken, undone by her own lies. I dialed the sheriff, voice low but steady, reporting her presence. By the time deputies arrived, she hadn't moved. They shone their flashlights over her, handcuffed her gently, and led her away without resistance. She never looked back. That night marked the true end of Karen's reign. The aftermath came quickly. Charges piled up: fraud, harassment, vandalism, trespassing, attempted arson. Guests she had scammed pressed their cases. Neighbors who had lost money through her rental scheme demanded restitution. Her name became toxic, whispered with bitterness where it had once been spoken with fear. The HOA didn't survive the fallout. Within months, it voted to dissolve entirely. The board disbanded, the bylaws were shredded, and the community shifted to a loose association of neighbors who managed their own properties without oversight. For the first time in years, people felt free. As for me, the weight slowly lifted. The fraudulent lien was struck from the record. My lawyer filed a civil suit that promised compensation for damages, though the money mattered less than the principle. My cabin, once a place of dread, began to feel like a home again. I repaired the scars on the porch, replaced the splintered door, and scrubbed away the smoke stains. The wounds of the battle didn't vanish, but they became reminders of what I had endured and survived. Neighbors who had once avoided me began to wave again. Some apologized outright for believing Karen's lies. Others quietly offered help with repairs or invited me to community dinners. The retired couple became close friends, their gratitude as deep as mine. Together, we built something Karen could never control: trust. I never saw her again after that night. Rumors swirled: jail time, bankruptcy, a move to another state under the shadow of disgrace. Whatever the truth, it didn't matter. She was gone, and with her, the poison she had spread through the neighborhood. In the end, it wasn't fire or fear or force that defeated her. It was the truth, patiently gathered, relentlessly pursued, held up to the light until her mask cracked. The cabin stands quiet now, the lake glittering beyond the trees. The nights filled with nothing but the calls of owls and the rustle of leaves. Peaceful, the way it was always meant to be. But sometimes, late at night, I still check the cameras before bed. Old habits die hard, and in the silence, I can almost hear her voice echoing from the past, shrill, furious, desperate, and I remember what it cost to reclaim this peace, because in the end, it wasn't just a battle against Karen, it was a battle against fear itself. And winning it meant I could finally call this cabin mine again, not just in name, but in spirit.